Good day everyone, so if you're a Genshin Impact or a Honkai Star Rail player, then you've no doubt seen the Gacha system, and you might be wondering, well, how does it actually work? What does it mean when Hoyo tells you that you have a 0.6% base pull rate or a consolidated 1.6% pull rate? These are just terms that they throw around, but not a lot of people actually understand them, and that's the point of today's video. Hopefully in a very simplistic way I can shed some light as to how this system works and how it's been cleverly designed to suck in as much money as possible from you, the player. So in today's video we'll only be looking at the 5-star characters. If you want a follow-up video for the 4-star, 3-stars, do let me know in the comment section, but let us try and answer the question of what it means to get a 5-star character. So before we begin, you'll see there's some fancy graph here on the screen. Don't worry, I'll explain this a bit later, but here are just a couple of quick facts. On average, it takes you 62 pulls to get a 5-star character. Now, a lot of you might say, well, that's not what I experience, and yes, that's part of the trick. That's not what you're supposed to experience. Half of all of you will actually only really get your 5-star character after 65 to 76 wishes. This is what we call the median. Generally speaking, as you can just sort of see here on the graph, your probability to get a 5-star actually decreases up until your 74th pull, in which case, or thereafter, it sort of increases. And here's a little bit of a fun fact: it is almost nearly impossible for you to take 90 wishes to get a 5-star. It is so incredibly unlikely. It's pretty much about 1 in a 14 million chance that it'll take you 90 wishes. So it's not all bad news, it's just mostly bad news. Right, so to make sense of all of this, we need to look at two key concepts, and that is the concept of rates and probabilities. So let me just talk a bit about rates. Rates are what determine when you get a 5-star in Genshin Impact, and how this works is pretty simple. So every single time when you pull on a character banner, the server generates a random number between 0 and 1. If this random number is less than your current pull rate, you will get the 5-star character. So at this point you might ask, well, how are these pull rates determined? Well, as MiHoYo advertises, you get a base pull rate of 0.006 if the current amount that you've sort of been pulling on a banner is less than 74. So if you have not pulled 74 times on a banner and gotten your 5-star, the game will assign you this base rate. If you've already pulled 74 times without getting your 5-star, then the game does something interesting. It actually increases your current pull rate by 6% cumulatively for every pull that you did not get your 5-star. So in other words, if you're at your 75th pull, you are going to get, as you can see according to the formula, 2 times 6% plus the 0.00 whatever little base rate to give you a current pull rate of 12.6%, and this just keeps on going 18%, 24, all the way up until your 90th pull. So this kind of makes sense. Once you get to your 74th pull, the rates increase in such a way such that it's very likely that this random number that the server generates will be less than your pull, and then you get your 5-star. So this is how the system is incredibly deceptive. So up until your 74th pull, the odds are very low at 6 out of 1,000, but after your 73 pulls, your rate is increased by 6% per pull, and the way in which this system behaves is almost as if the pulling rate was constant at 1.6%, but it only behaves so on average, and that is a very key point to sort of take away. But this is really what MiHoYo means when they say your base rate is 0.6% and your consolidated rate is 1.6%. So it's a consolidation of all of these different changing rates to give you a rate on average. If we visualize this, you can sort of make a per rate per given pull graph, and this is sort of how it looks. So at the bottom you can see up until your 74th pull, your pull rate is pretty terrible, but it's like 6 out of 1,000 as mentioned, and thereafter you can see your pull rate actually climbs quite substantially, and by your 90th pull you are almost 100% guaranteed to get your 5-star. So that is the concept of pull rates. So now let's get into the concept of probabilities. Probabilities are not the same as rates, but rather they're a means for us to assign a chance or a likelihood of you getting a specific outcome from a given fixed set of outcomes. Now, this is obviously a bit of an informal definition, but let's look at a simple example. So everyone is probably familiar with the concept of a dice. You roll a dice, you either get a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or a 6 once it's rolled, and the odds that you get any one of those outcomes has a fixed probability of occurring. Because a dice has 6 faces, the probability is of course 1 out of 6 for every single outcome, and you can obviously do some funky things now that you know the probabilities, such as calculate the average value of 3.5. Now, where this gets really interesting is if all of the probabilities are not even. So let me give you a bit of an example. So here is a graph that shows you a fair dice, here in example 1, where every outcome or the face value of the dice has an even probability, 16, a 1 out of 6, or a 16.6% chance of occurring. When you have a loaded dice or an uneven dice, each one of these outcomes are completely different. So I've just sort of randomly assigned them outcomes, but if you were to roll this dice in example 2, there's a much higher likelihood that you will roll a 4 instead of a 1, which only has a 5% chance of actually happening. But just like with the fair dice, you can also calculate the mean value of your uneven dice as being 3.7, and this just tells you that it's more likely for you to roll a higher value than it is for you to roll an even value like 3.5. This is just what these sort of numbers mean. So this is the key concept that I want you to understand about probabilities. You have an outcome, and you have an associated probability assigned to those outcomes. Right, so hopefully if you've been following along now, you fully understand the idea of a probability graph. But before we get into actually calculating the probabilities and how we get these for Genshin Impact, we need another more useful tool to sort of help us, and that is the concept of cumulative probabilities. In very simple English, all you do to get a cumulative probability is that you add all the probabilities that you have for each one of your outcomes up to a specific point together. So let's say you wanted to get a cumulative probability for the third dice roll, like the third face on your dice. That's very, very easy. You just add 5 to 10 to 25 to get to 40. And it's the same for the fourth value here. You just add 5, 10, 25, and 35. You add everything cumulatively, in other words. So this concept of a cumulative probability graph is still very, very simple. It's an outcome, but instead of showing you a probability, we show you a cumulative probability. And the reason I bring this up is because in the case of Genshin Impact, calculating cumulative probabilities is a lot easier. In fact, it's way, way, way easier than directly calculating these probability masses. And the benefit of calculating either one of these two graphs is that you can always swap between them. So if you've got the one graph, you automatically have the other graph. And the other thing is cumulative probabilities are just easier for you to sort of read off probability. So for instance, if I had to ask the question, what is the probability of your loaded dice landing on a value between 2 and 4 inclusive, you only need to perform two operations. That is, you need to take the value of 4 right here, the value of 1, and you just subtract the 2 to get the probability that your dice will land between 2, 3, and 4, or on 2, 3, and 4. My bad. Right, so if you've been following now along very, very diligently, you are now ready to sort of look at the probability and cumulative probability graphs for Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail. And this is the graph that I sort of showed you in the beginning of this presentation. Hopefully it makes a lot more sense. You have the outcomes here on the x-axis, that is the number of pulls it will take you to get your 5-star, and on the y-axis is the probability of you actually getting it within that specific specific number of pulls. So one of the things that you can immediately note is that the odds that you'll get it before your 74th pull are extremely low, and you can see that in fact counterintuitively your odds are slightly higher to get back-to-back 5 stars than it is to get a 5-star here and then only 40 wishes later, etc, etc. But what is very telling from this graph is the fact that the majority of the probability lies between your 60th and sort of 80th pull. The majority of the times that you will get a 5-star is sort of contained in this region. And this is precisely why I wanted to introduce the concept of a cumulative probability graph, because now things are a lot easier to read. So for instance, if I had to ask the question of what is the probability of getting your 5-star between your 50th and 80th pull, well, that is 65%. So basically, the majority of players have a very high likelihood of only getting their desired 5-star after about 50 pulls. In fact, what we know from this graph is that 50%, so if I read the 0.5 line here, 50% of all of the Genshin Impact players will only get their 5-star after about 76 pulls. That is the power of this cumulative graph, and it shows you exactly how the hard and the soft sort of pity works. Hard pity would be something like after your 82nd pull or whatever, but your soft pity starts here at 74, and in this area you have then obviously the highest likelihood of getting your desired character. In essence, you only have a 33% chance of actually getting your 5-star within 74 pulls. So how do we actually go about calculating these curves? So this is kind of difficult. This is the more difficult part of the presentation, but the way in which this works is that you first calculate these cumulative graphs, and once you've calculated these points, you take the differences to get back to these probability graphs, and then you can obviously use the probability graph to calculate all sorts of interesting stats like the mean, standard deviation, etc, etc. So how do you work out these cumulative probabilities? Well, the strategy is actually fairly simple for when your pulls are less than 74. What we do is we employ a very simple trick of probability. The probability that you can get a 5-star within, let's say, 40 pulls, and the probability that you did not get the 5-star within 74 pulls must just add up to 1. So from this very simple strategy, we can calculate the cumulative probabilities very, very simply as follows. What we do is we say the probability to get the 5-star within X pulls is just 1 minus the probability that you did not get it. So what's the probability of not getting it? Well, that's simple. You take the pulling rate and you subtract 1 from it. So it's 1 minus the pulling rate, and that gives you the probability of not getting a 5-star character on that pull. And if you did not get a 5-star character for 50 pulls in a row, you multiply this occurrence 50 times with itself. So it's a probability that you did not get it in the first pull and the second pull and the third pull, so you multiply them all together, and what you then get is the total probability of not getting the 5-star, from which you just then obviously subtract 1, and that gives you your desired probability. Perhaps a simple example will illustrate it. So you just use the formula I give you, and for instance, to get the probability of a 5-star within 40 pulls, you plug it in, and that is 21.39%. So this is the cumulative probability, and you might now ask, well, what is the probability that I get a 5-star on the 40th pull? Well, to do this, we need to work out the two cumulative probabilities. So the probability that you get it within 40 pulls and the probability that you get it within 49 pulls, we subtract it like I sort of showed you earlier with cumulative probabilities, and then you can get the correct probability of 0.47%. Note that this is different from the pulling rate of 0.6%, and this shows you why this concept of a rate is actually misleading, in that your odds are actually a bit lower than what they sort of like advertise there. But this is just the concept of a rate versus a probability at work. Now, this is the strategy for pools less than 74. For pools greater than 74, it becomes a bit more complicated. So I'm going to leave this up for those of you that are experts. But in essence, because we have that the rate changes constantly, we need to use an iterative procedure by appropriately considering the previous probability. So you need to consider the failure rate plus the survival rate multiplied by the rate that you sort of now getting for your 74th pull, and that's how you calculate this. On your 75th pull, you need to now consider the survival rates for your previous pulls, and it just keeps on adding onto itself. For those of you that can read mathematics, this is sort of the formula, and of course here is an extra recursive function that you'll need to sort of do it. Spending time on this is perhaps not worth it, but you can just trust me that there is a way to do this mathematically. Right, so now that you've worked out all the probabilities, we can get to the final thing, and that is, how does Hoyo get to this idea of a consolidated rate of 1.6%? Well, that is very, very simple. What we do is we take all the probabilities, the normal probabilities, and we just do a sort of little simple sum product on them. So it's like calculating the average. 1 over this then gives you your pulling rate. So that is pretty much how you do it. And the big lesson or takeaway from this video, hopefully, is to sort of convince you that just by looking at average or mean values is very, very deceptive. The mean number of pulls is so far away from the median number of pulls, which means that it is very unlikely for you to really reliably get to an average of 62.29 pulls. So this is just a way for Hoyo to suck away your money before you actually do enough pulls to eventually catch up to that average. This is obviously the concept of variance, so there's lots of variation in the amount of pulls that you can get, and it's all because of the way in which they designed that probability curve. And that is what's so deceptive about this gacha. So if there's anything that you take away from this video, is that Hoyo has very cleverly designed their probability curves in such a way to extract the most amount of money from you, and it's very unintuitive like how it all works. As a bit of a bonus for those of you that are still around, I will sort of just link some of the Python code that you yourself could sort of run in order to get all of the results that I've shown you. So everything that you can see here is coded up, everything works, I've tested it and calculated it. If you just run this code as is, you will get an output in a CSV format, and then you can also then draw up the curves, or if you're going to do like I do, you can just sort of run the script as is, and you will get all three of the probability curves that will be sort of like shown on here. So as you can see here in Python, we get all the right curves, and obviously there is a average number or average pull for a 5-star, which is exactly what I sort of talked about, using about, I think, what's this, 1.5 million simulations and so on. So there is a bit of Python code, for those of you that want to sort of dabble into it. Everything should be like transparent in terms of how it works. And with that, thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Hopefully this has been quite informative. Oops, that's the wrong one. All right, thank you guys so much for watching, and yeah, do keep well and let me know what you thought about all of this. Cheers.